Hair metal is something that was hated just as much as it was successful in the mid to late 80s. True headbangers dismissed the style as regressive and pop-oriented in regards to the music, and when it came to the image, it was downright sickening, especially as someone who grabbed a fresh copy of Slayer's Reign in Blood in 1986. The big hair, the neon spandex, the makeup, and all that animal print defined not just hair metal, but a great deal of 80s fashion in general, as the genre welcomed new legions of fans more in tune with the mainstream than the rumblings of underground heavy metal. It was a time where excess in all incarnations was celebrated, but if you didn't grow up in the 80s, you're probably wondering how the hell we even let hair metal happen. In part, Van Halen should shoulder quite a lot of this blame, but we'll get to that a little bit later. I promise though, it all makes sense, just give me a few minutes, okay? The stage for hair metal's ascension was set in the 70s with glam rock, also known as glitter rock. As with most good things in rock, it can largely be traced back to England. Back me up here, John Wiederhorn.
There was the glam that you had emerging out of England with David Bowie, T-Rex, and the Sweet. Slade, of course, too, were a big part of the glam scene. Slade had a direct connection to Quiet Riot. Quiet Riot's two biggest hits were actually Slade songs. So there was this connection with the wild dress and the abrasive. It wasn't so abrasive, it was more celebratory, but the guitars were loud. They were loud and they were distorted.
Glitter rock, like most new trends in music, was a reaction to and rejection of the previous generation's music. That scene, of course, was the psychedelic rock and whole flower power movement, which was highly political as well as spiritually enlightened. There was free love too. Not everything had to go. Perhaps though, this free love and liberal mindedness paved the way for the rejection of gender roles in the age of androgyny that glitter rock so deeply clung to. Musically, this scene was intent on stripping away long-winded jam sessions and getting back to the basics of what makes a great, straightforward rock song, taking cues from bubblegum pop and other bygone eras that predated hard rock. It was feel-good, four-on-the-floor, stomp and groove music that endorsed life's simpler pleasures with the sole aim of just having a good time. Meanwhile, in the US, there was the emergence of the New York art rock and punk scenes, with the bands such as the Velvet Underground, the New York Dolls, and the Ramones, who, while all stylistically very different, fostered an environment for hair metal's arrival to take place in the Northeast, in addition to the infamous Sunset Strip scene in Los Angeles, which spawned many of the most iconic hair bands. Among those groups were Cinderella, who were originally from Pennsylvania, as were Poison, but they relocated to LA. And Cinderella would play the South New Jersey club circuit, while Twisted Sister had a stranglehold on North Jersey and New York.
Seeing Twisted Sister was amazing. I loved the New York Dolls. I loved that whole glam scene. I loved the attitude of it. They were that on steroids, and they were heavy. One of the loudest things I'd ever seen live.
It was a full decade before Twisted Sister would get signed and eventually rise to superstardom, but before that, they cut their teeth in clubs, making a full-time job out of it, as most bands did around the time.
I developed my chops and woodshedded in cover bands that played 5 nights a week, 5 sets a night every week. Started in high school. I was on the work-study program, which they say you have a job, and I said, yeah, I got a job. I'd get out of school at 11 and go home and sleep and get up and play clubs all night and go back to school. You know, there was no term hair metal or glam or anything. We were just out playing Zeppelin covers and Aerosmith and AC/DC. And at some point, I felt, you know, I want to make records. I decided to pull out of the club scene and just started writing songs.
For Twisted Sister, the imagery was a byproduct of simply needing to capture the attention of a bar crowd whose first priority was to drink. The live bands were there as secondary entertainment, and that didn't sit right with the proud and perfectly arrogant Dee Snider, who commanded the spotlight and set his sights on winning over crowds. He'd taunt them between songs, eventually becoming one of the all-time kings of stage banter, and the makeup and outfits, which were crafted by his then-girlfriend and now-wife Suzette, were in place to give bar patrons something to talk about and even more to look at, because, in reality, they had no clue what they were looking at. While Cinderella and Twisted Sister tore up the Northeast circuit, Def Leppard were coming up across the pond. Originally, the band was part of the early new wave of British heavy metal scene, though that would fade after their first album and they released High and Dry, which was loaded with the best riffs Angus Young never wrote. Though they wielded influence from the English glitter rockers, Def Leppard's development was uniquely their own as they amounted to this massive pop metal mainstream machine by the time Hysteria was unleashed upon the world in 1987. And then there was that thing bubbling in LA where glitter rock was having a profound effect as well as one groundbreaking party group. Remember how I told you I'd get to Van Halen? Well, Here it is. Brace yourselves for an uncomfortable reality, okay? Before they cut their debut album and blew a downward sliding, drug-addled Black Sabbath off the stage every single night, Van Halen were one of the leading club bands in Los Angeles, carefully balancing Eddie Van Halen's eccentric lead guitar playing with the hook-driven riffs and the charisma of frontman David Lee Roth, who extolled the virtues of rock's affinity for sex and drugs, and nailed some pretty sick split kicks.
I mean, it's unquestionably about partying and rocking and drinking. And they were an LA band, so all these guys who would join hair metal bands saw them and were undeniably influenced by them because they were so good and they were flashy in a different way. But Eddie Van Halen was probably the most important guitarist to lead to what other bands did in commercial metal and especially hair metal. He and Randy Rhoads were kind of the kings of the era to me. It wasn't all anymore so much about Iommi and Blackmore. They were kind of more old guard. So with this flashy new sound and this pyrotechnic guitar approach, everything was just escalated and really kind of turned into this party. It was just rock and roll to lose yourself to and be crazy with.
And it got crazy. Van Halen shows reached new heights of sleaze as David Lee Roth has gone on record recalling that the band would go so far as to lock the doors of the clubs to prevent police entry while they held wet t-shirt contests on stage during their set. I think you could see how this had a trickle-down effect a few years later as the Sunset Strip exploded with new acts looking to adopt the rock and roll lifestyle, even if they had yet to sign to a label or really achieve much of anything. Things got competitive and bands were copying everything from other local acts, from wardrobe ideas to sexual partners. This competitive element was a breeding ground for more than just STDs. Hair metal, a term not yet applied to the budding early 80s scene, was a pissing contest that was spiraling out of control, and if you meditate on that literal image for a moment, it's not hard to see how it eventually splashed everyone in sight. Then, on August 1st, 1981, the world of music changed for good. MTV launched. With the focus on music videos, this triggered a radical shift in the way record labels approached new signings. And conveniently, Motley Crue self-released their debut album, Too Fast for Love, 3 months later, unwittingly kickstarting a new era of metal.
It was very important, obviously, especially with when MTV came about, the look of the band, not just the outfits, but the way the guys looked or the girls looked or whatever, drew attention to that. So, if you had like 4 or 5 guys in great shape that really looked good with hair out to here, then you were guaranteed people were going to look at the screen, and if you had good songs to go along with it, well, hey, you got a winning combination.
Well, there was a mystique in the 70s. MTV changed all of that. And we had a camera in front of us 24/7, and there was 24/7 access. So I think all the bands, even some of the bands that came from the 70s, like Aerosmith, played to the camera harder because there was such a visual aspect to it.
It was a time of transition for those 70s artists who now had to play by a new rule book. But Aerosmith owed as much to MTV as they did to legendary A&R man John Kalodner, who got the band clean and sober and brought in outside writers, which resulted in a return to multi-platinum status with 1987's Permanent Vacation. Kalodner rebooted Whitesnake too, and encouraged David Coverdale to rework the previously released versions of Here I Go Again and Crying in the Rain, turning them into all-time mega hits from the Hair era. Getting the hard-bodied, big-haired John Sykes as Coverdale's new sidearm guitarist helped quite a bit too. But I digress. The first metal music video to air on MTV was actually for Iron Maiden's self-titled song, and fortunately, they never fell victim to the glam parade that followed, and their career took a much different trajectory that relied on little to no airplay. But not every band was capable of becoming international superstars just by word of mouth like Eddie and the Boys. Once Elektra signed Motley Crue and properly released the band's debut, it'd be 2 years before it went gold, and at that point, it was clear they were onto something with this new style of heavy music. Seemingly every band with a demo and a regular club gig got snatched up by labels looking to cash in on the next trend, which was exacerbated by the highly sellable image that was now plastering television screens in every home.
I mean, metal built that freaking network. At a time when they were coming out with videos and they were looking for acts that were now, they needed people that were visually compelling. They were discovering there was a reason why Joe Jackson's shoes were the only thing on the album cover. Get a look at Joe.
Hey, easy there, D. Oh, that Joe. Okay. From there came Headbangers Ball, which was a rebranding of Dee Snider's Metal Mania idea he pitched to MTV as a metal-only program. This furthered the exposure of what became hair metal as Poison, Rat, Def Leppard, Motley Crue, Dokken, Whitesnake, Quiet Riot, Warrant, Skid Row, Cinderella, LA Guns, and more ran amok atop the world and under the sheets. It couldn't last forever though, and it didn't. But that's for another time. There's more than just grunge to blame for hair metal's downfall, you know. There's a lot more to blame than just the arrival of grunge in regards to hair metal's short-term extinction. Sure, in 1991, Nirvana's Nevermind was pretty much the same thing as that asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, only instead of taking out behemoth-sized reptiles that are actually more likely to have been birds, Nevermind wiped out animal print clothing, not actual animals. But let's not pretend like hair metal wasn't trending in this direction anyway, on the verge of imploding as the levels of excess reached critical mass when the new decade dawned. So what exactly was going wrong? Where do we even start? What better place than good old sex, drugs, and rock and roll? After all, is that adage more true of any brand of rock than hair metal? Inevitably, there's going to be some burnout when there's such a consistent level of high-volume alcohol consumption, not to mention what else was being injected, snorted, swallowed, and smoked. The Reaper was beginning to take its toll within the hair metal scene, taking young lives with others not far behind. By the time Nirvana's Nevermind came around, Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue had already been pronounced dead from a heroin overdose before a miraculous turn of events in the moment that led to his second chance at life. Hanoi Rocks drummer Razzle's life had been claimed in a car accident at the fault of Crue's Vince Neil, who was drunk behind the wheel, speeding recklessly to get more booze. Def Leppard's Steve Clark died from a mixture of morphine and alcohol, reportedly having a blood alcohol level of 0.30 at the time of his death. And just a couple years later, the bell nearly tolled for Guns N' Roses bass player Duff McKagan, who was drinking so heavily that his pancreas swelled to the size of a football, putting him in grave danger as he sustained internal third-degree burns from the issue.
You want to die. You know, you really do. Like, the pain is so bad. Like, I was asking, like, just put me out. It's brutal. But for me, that I needed, you know, some people, like, can walk into a brick wall once and then go, aha, I'm going to walk around. It took me 105 times just walking into that brick wall. And that was my last time walking in the brick wall with alcohol, for sure.
With the entire scene falling victim to one of three things they almost exclusively wrote about, the other two being sex and love, which, in regards to hair metal, are quite different things. The flame was starting to fade.
It was an incestuous scene, and it was one that was really built around partying. It's one of maybe two palpable metal scenes that you could say were built on partying, excess, and chicks. And these band members at the time were unashamed of talking about all their gory exploits.
Suddenly, all the guys who made their money thrusting their way through your living rooms as MTV blared on were in touch with their feelings and their sensitive side, longing for love, not just loving and indulging in the carnal carnival of backstage romp sessions.
Hair metal took down itself because everything kind of got same-ish, and every band got big by doing a power ballad, so they wanted to do more and more power ballads. Not that many were really great at the format.
Though somehow, there were still enough multi-disc compilation albums dedicated to just the best ballads of the era. Sorry, John, keep going.
The record labels they were on, seeing that these other types of music, thrash and alternative metal, were kind of stealing some of their audience, were encouraging these guys to sell records. And how do you sell records? By dumbing down and appealing more to the mainstream.
Ballads and even power ballads predated hair metal, and it was certainly a known, successful format, but dyed-in-the-wool rockers weren't intent on placing all of their focus on sad-sounding love songs. Love was recognized as part of human emotion, which even the most degenerate musicians weren't immune to. But when Motley Crue put out Home Sweet Home in 1985, hair metal suddenly had a new mandate beyond teased hair, tight pants, and the long-lost codpiece. When is that thing making a comeback anyway? If you were considered to be among the glam scene, there was really no point of even considering releasing an album if you didn't have a sappy, stripped-back song where the only traceable bit of rock came when an electric guitar solo inevitably came crashing halfway into it. The money was easy, and for a group of musicians who just a couple years ago had no place to live and no cash to feed themselves, saying no to this whole ballad thing wasn't really an option. Besides, it attracted an even wider fan base of women, and what lusty rocker was going to turn that away? It became problematic when the scene morphed into a parody of itself, and suddenly hair metal wasn't that far apart from what Michael Bolton was doing. Fun fact, Bolton started his career as a metal guy and even auditioned for Black Sabbath once. This surge in popularity even trickled into the deep underground. Yes, it's time we address Celtic Frost's Cold Lake. The Swiss group had completely jumped the shark, which was especially telling for a band that had gone a bit avant-garde just 1 year earlier, boldly opening the Into the Pandemonium record with the cover of Wall of Voodoo's Mexican Radio. Tom G. Warrior and company adopted a quasi-glam look and revamped their whole sound to fall more in line with the current times, failing on an unprecedented level. Still, there's something morbidly appealing about such an odd turn of events.
I'd rather have that. I don't believe in mistakes when it comes to music. Bands do what they want to do, and sometimes, of course, there might be an ulterior motive or a hidden agenda why you do a record. It might be that you want to sell more. You think that, okay, let's cater to the mainstream heavy metal scene and put out a record that could sell to Poison fans or whatever they wanted at the time. But I still respect that much more than staying the same for the sake of it.
But once you're in the mainstream, there's always the threat of the next wave or the next trend looking to catch the ears of the worldwide population in the next generation. Fashion trends, along with musical ones, fade almost overnight and rarely survive longer than a decade. Hair metal is no exception.
There's a shift every decade. It's kind of strange. If you're from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s. I think the 80s it felt like there was more of a systematic dismissal by the industry as opposed to a natural fizzling out. There were bands from the 70s that survived on their own, and some that didn't, and bands from the 60s that survived into the 70s on it, There was a label attached to the 80s, maybe that was a negative thing. That's just part of the business, and I think it's the nature of how big the 80s blew up because of MTV and all of that. We started feeling that in the early 90s. We were on our third record, Heartbreak Station, and I remember sitting down at a big, long board table at Mercury Records, and we had only sold 1.5 million records on the first 2 singles, and I'm quoting them. And they said that there was this new wave of stuff coming, and they were gonna kind of just take it easy on this record, and they weren't gonna release another single, and we were kind of like, you're kidding, right?
It's not hard to understand why labels began distancing themselves from a scene that was so morally bankrupt. With the ballad cash-in nearing the tipping point, it was easier for executives to wash their hands completely of these bands, who would cost them a fortune in bailouts, trashed hotel rooms, bar tabs, and lawsuits.
The hair metal image was completely countered to that of the new wave of thought coming with the political correctness of some of the alternative bands, the feminism that came along with alternative rock. You were no longer in an era where, pardon the expression, but chicks were considered playthings to a lot of hair metal bands. It was all consensual, or mostly consensual. But suddenly, I think these groups didn't see girls as people to feed them and people to sleep with. They saw them as human beings with thoughts and ideas and artistic inclinations and musical skills.
Grunge rejected all the values of the 80s party scene and the rock star diva attitude altogether. Striving for a return to roots approach in rock, they presented more honest versions of themselves, wearing the same clothes on stage that they had just gone to the grocery store in earlier that afternoon. While they didn't admit it, they were heavily influenced by artists from the 70s such as Black Sabbath, Aerosmith, and Led Zeppelin, adopting a grim outlook on society as well as themselves.
Certainly, you had these bands coming out that were doing new things with distortion, new things with kind of mixing punk with a Sabbathy sound, ranging from almost early Sabbath worship of early Nirvana to the frantic punk rock nihilism of Mudhoney. And it was new and it was different and it was cool and it was down-tuned, kids loved it. It was self-deprecating. It was a time when I think kids got out of college or high school and just didn't know what they were going to do with their lives. It was sort of this climate where people were wondering if they would be as popular or successful as their parents were, and I think a lot of them were doubting it.
For a scene as shallow as hair metal, it offered no hint of evolution, the necessary component for every band's survival, especially in times of change. Drinking, fighting, and f***ing is all well and good, but it doesn't sound all that cool anymore from guys in their mid-30s who still sing about sneaky basement sex to keep a woman's dad from finding out. Actually, it's kind of even weirder right now, considering they're all in their late 50s and early 60s. I mean, hell, Winger still plays 17, a song about wanting to hook up with an underage girl. Gross, dude. For many of those rockers, nostalgia is the one drug they still can't kick.